glad that you're all here. So it's basically thank you so much for being here and that you want to hear about Camunda. My plan for today is to talk a bit about microservices and how that relates to Camunda and how that relates also overall to basically to workflow automation. And what we see, and I mean, that's probably not a surprise, that's not a secret, but just for setting the scene, is that we're seeing that more and more companies, more and more of our customers and users, they are basically splitting up their software into like smaller pieces. It's normally, nowadays, it's microservices. It's sometimes probably even already serverless, like function and these kind of things. It might still be named services, SOA services or whatever, but it basically means we're cut functionality into smaller pieces. If you look at microservice in particular, one thing that's important from my perspective to look at or to emphasize is that it's a lot about autonomy. If you have a microservice, and I come back to that later on, that's why it's important. If you have a microservice, it means that you have one team dedicated for caring about that. You have one owner who should constantly think about what the microservice is doing. You probably deploy that independently. It's their own piece of software, an own piece of application running probably on an own whatever container or whatever it is, and it has its own data. So it's very autonomous. The idea is that it can easily change it without changing other parts of the system, right? We're coming back to that later on. So that's basically how I see microservices. I was speaking at QCon the last days, which is here in New York. They do something, you probably know that InfoQ, they're doing a lot of articles. And they did a trends report, architecture trends report this year. And there's one thing which I personally find that hilarious. So there's microservice on it. And you see they put it on late maturity, which basically means most people are now doing microservices. They start doing microservices. But, and that's really awesome, correctly built distributed systems, that's early maturity. And that basically means, like, the translation is everybody does microservices, which are per definition a distributed system, but nobody understands how to do that, right? And I think that's a big problem we're seeing today. That's a big problem. And I personally believe, I might be biased, but I really believe in that, is that they also put it, by the way, lightweight workflow and decision automation platforms in there, which is kind of, I feel ourselves being reflected there, which is, I think, part of the solution as well. And I want to go into that in more detail today. That's my plan. I'm an example guy, so I always use examples. And I have this, let's say, very simple order fulfillment example I always do, right? In your head, you might transfer that to your own domain, but I hope it's easy to understand. So you want to order something, then you have to pay for it. It's fetched basically from the warehouse, and it's shipped to your place, right? If you translate that in microservices or domains or bounded context or whatever your name is for that, you might have a checkout microservice, you might have a payment microservice, inventory, and shipment, okay? How do we do that workflow here if we are in a microservice world? That's an interesting question, actually. And one thing I'm normally discussing, so if you're already a bit into the BPM space, a bit in the workflow space, normally people come up with the idea, yes, that's an orchestration process. And I actually even hear the term orchestration process very often, that people think of, yeah, we need that over there, like, okay, something is ordered, then, for example, we want to retrieve payment, wait for it, and so on and so forth. So we basically do that orchestration process, which orchestrates other services what they should do, right? The problem I have with that term, actually, and it's more or less with the term, but it normally reflects a way of thinking about it, is I don't see an orchestration process as something special. It's nothing special. It's basically, it's an implementation detail of that order microservice. So what you basically want to do, you want to have a domain which is responsible for doing order fulfillment. That's what you do, and that's a microservice in the microservices world. So I don't see the orchestration process as something special. So every workflow you have in a microservice world must be owned by a microservice, right? So it's an implementation detail of the microservice. It's nothing special. That's very different to how we perceived or how we did BPM like 10 years back, right? So it's not about SOA. when we did SOA, 5 or 10 years back, it was very often a bit like this. We had the services, and then we had infrastructure like an ESB or probably BPM tools. And then we did that orchestration process in that infrastructure. We had the BPM tool, and there we said, hey, orchestrate these SOA services for me. And that was a different thinking, which not really aligns with the autonomy thoughts of the microservice. So who is responsible of doing that? Is it a central infrastructure team? How do I change the workflow? If I change the order process, normally I had to adjust services and that thing, and it didn't really work out. So we saw a lot of problems with these ESB and SOA approach, right? And that's why I think we have to think differently. It might be a small thought, but I think it's very important. And connected to that is, if you do microservices, you should avoid something I call the BPMN monolith, right? If you do a monolithic system, you can do monolithic processes. That makes a lot of sense. But if you want to do microservices, you should think differently. And that's actually my example for a BPMN monolith in that scenario. And I have an idea why, but I see very often, as soon as you start doing BPMN, as soon as you start doing this kind of modeling, a lot of people tend to put all the information they have in that one model. Like here, whatever, we want to fetch the goods from warehouse, they're not on stock, so we want to reorder the goods. If you read our book, by the way, we have an example which is more or less like that in the book. So we are guilty of that as well. If you build a monolith, that might be fine, but if you're doing microservices, you violate the ownerships of the microservices because reordering is none of the business of the order fulfillment. Order fulfillment should care about order fulfillment, not about reordering. The inventory cares about reordering. How they do that? I don't care if I do order fulfillment. So this violates a lot of ownerships. If you have such a process, it's hard to agree on what's the current process. And it's hard to change, it's hard to deploy. You have to ask too many people. So that's why that doesn't work. If you do microservices, you have to slice your workflow into the appropriate pieces of the ownership of the different microservices. So you can have order fulfillment, and that's just doing the things for order fulfillment. So in our case, it says, hey, retrieve the payment first or whatever, fetch the stuff from the warehouse. I don't care about any details, just tell me when you're done. Right? Tell me the result. That's it. And all the details, for example, for how do I do the payment? That might be a workflow in itself, which might be very complicated. Like I want to charge the credit card. I probably need to update the credit card if it's expired, whatever. There's a lot of complexity in there, but that's part of the payment. It's an own workflow. And you have to keep that separated. And from an architecture point of view, I even don't know if there's a workflow involved. I don't care. That's an API in between them. Right? I just retrieve payment for me, and that's it. It sounds easy if you see it on the slide, actually, but I think that's one of the central thoughts you have to have if you want to do workflow automation and BPM together with microservices. And that's what a lot of people still don't understand in there and why they reject the idea of workflows in microservices, because they think of the BPMN monolith. Okay? So that's one of the first important thoughts here. The second thing, and that's also, I would say, equally important and also equally often not really understood, is nowadays we are moving towards event-driven architectures. It's not a new topic. It's been around for years. So there's an event-driven architecture book which is 10 to 15 years old. But now it's really picked up in the industry for several reasons. First of all, we need more scalability, we need bigger applications. The cloud is basically coming, so if you go for serverless, most of the stuff is event-driven. So there are a lot of drivers why we go event-driven. Let's make a quick example that you get an idea what I mean by event-driven. So let's assume I have these microservices, and if they publish events on some kind of bus, it's kind of a broadcast. I tell the world something has happened. I don't care who's picking it up. Just, hey world, something has happened. If you do this, what you could, for example, build, you could build a service somewhere which picks up all these events, says, hey, if there was an order placed, I want to send in whatever, an email to the customer, and, hey, we got your order. Or, hey, yeah, your payment was received. Hey, we shipped your order. So you could build a service independent of the others. And you could build that without changing the others. You don't have to think about, hey, where in that whole thing do I need to incorporate emails and then probably change all of them in order to send all the emails. So That's the idea of event-driven, and that's a good example where it decouples your system a bit. So this is really, you can build that without changing the others. You can change that without changing the others. So that's a good example where event-driven is a good idea to do, right? Okay. Now, like always, as soon as you have this new tool like event-driven, you try to use that for everything, right? That's the typical thing what we do in IT. So yes, event-driven is cool. What I saw a lot of people doing now is what I call an event chain. So if you want to implement that workflow here, like I want to do my order fulfillment, you can do that by event-driven notifications. So you could say, hey, somebody ordered something, right? He checked out something in my shop. That's an event. So the payment service could say, hey, if there was something checked out, I need to collect the money for it. As soon as he did that, then eventually could know, oh, if there was an order paid, I have to collect the goods from stock. And if that's done, the shipment could say, okay, now I have to ship it to the customer, right? That's kind of what I call an event chain. So I just have event notifications and somebody subscribing to it. But in the end, I get the workflow implemented. That's what's called a choreography, typically, right? And the idea is, and you find actually a lot of opinions in the internet, in books, that this is a good idea to do for everything. That's a loosely coupled thing, right? I personally have a lot of problems with that picture. I don't feel very well if I look at that. And that's mainly because I don't understand the workflow anymore. There's not a single point where you can look onto you and say, hey, this is how the workflow is implemented. It's hard to understand these kind of systems because they're just like emerging. It's a bit, I know that's a totally unfair comparison, but it always reminds me a bit of, I have database triggers. I write something in database, something else happens. I write something in and after some time, I don't understand what's happening, and I dare touch it because I don't know what happens, right? And that's a bad situation to be in. That's a really bad situation to be in. I had that feeling from the very beginning. And when I discussed that, when people started picking that up, and when I discussed that, it was normally like, yeah, but you're the workflow guy. Your tool is not on the slide. Of course you hate that. I mean, people don't need your tool if they do that. But for me, that was never the reason, but that was the argument against me. And I personally was super happy when there was a blog post from Martin Fowler. You probably know Martin Fowler. Yeah, the IT people should probably. He's quite a guy. He has 215K followers on Twitter, so that means he has some influence. And he wrote about event-driven. And he wrote exactly my feeling in that blog post. He said, the danger is it's very easy to make nicely decoupled systems with an event notification. That's the main reason why we're doing that, right? Without realizing that you're losing sight of a larger scale flow. That's exactly what I had. And thus set yourself up for trouble in future years, right? So that's exactly my feeling with that as well. There are actually a couple of ways to get back some overview of that. So the first problem is the losing the sight, so you're not understanding what's happening. I wrote a piece on InfoQ myself, beginning of the year, where I looked into that. So there's a URL. So if you want to read that back, there are a couple of ways of gaining back insights. And that's, for example, about distributed tracing. You might have heard about that. Tools like Zipkin or Jaeger or X-Ray. They basically do kind of let's say, a stack trace, but in a distributed system. So you can start to understand something, but that's very technical, actually. Or you can do like an event monitoring, where you collect all the events and then have some whatever, like an Elastic Stack, Kibana stack, where you can look into that. That's what a lot of customers are actually doing. But then you have to build a lot of things yourself, and so on and so forth. So I basically looked through that a bit. And what you can see is that it's not totally easy to get back that overview, but it's not impossible. So that's, at least there's some hope in there, let's say. What we're, just by the way, what we're currently building, and we're searching, let's say, beta customers for that, or beta contacts for that. So if you're kind of interested, if you're doing an event-driven architecture, that's the hook where I say, hey, please talk to me afterwards. What we do is, if you have an event bus, like whatever, Kafka, or whatever it is, and you have these events, you saw Optimize earlier on, the tool like where we do all the analysis. Currently, Optimize takes the data from our own engine, from the Camunda engine. But we currently teach it to also be able to get whatever events from a bus and then derive a workflow model from that, right? And then be able to collect all the data and do all the analysis, you know, from Optimize on this kind of data without a Camunda engine running, right? So if that's to some extent interesting for you, talk to me later. But again, this gives you probably some overview. So that can be helpful to get some overview. But that's only, for me, that's only half of the equation. So it's still something very often referred to emerging behavior. Or I just picked that slide because I like the original slide. And that's really like we see that, like, what the hell just happened? Why did that happen, right? I have no idea. I have to figure it out. And I have other sources. I didn't include all the slides here, but for example, Credit Sense, they said they had to reason about multiple code bases to understand what's going on. It's really hard because they're playing ping pong different services. So that's the problem of choreography. Choreography, if you think, like if you watch like talks or these kind, yeah, basically talks about choreography from very, very famous people actually. Normally this picture is used, this metaphor, right? It's kind of a beautiful dance. It's kind of, there's not a central conductor like doing that because everybody is a professional dancer. They know how to behave, right? So you can add another one, another microservice. It knows how to behave. And then it's a beautiful dance. It's not exactly what I see at the customers when they're doing it. It's kind of, I mean, it's hard to manage. It's hard to understand. It kind of starts to be chaotic a bit. And that's, I'm not saying that choreography is a wrong approach. I see a big value in that, but it's not that it really solves all your problems. You have to balance that with something else, which is called orchestration. And let's look at an example. So if we, for example, if we want to change the sequence of things, let's say we want to collect the payment before we want to collect the goods before we do the payment, same day delivery with a drone, for example. So that it's really even these kind of processes are not that stable anymore. If you want to do that in this scenario, what you have to do, you have to adjust all the 3 services down here because they now have to listen to different events, right? I can do that again. I actually love doing that. So there, you have to adjust all these 3 services, right? That's one thing. You have to adjust them, but you also have to do a coordinated deployment, right? It's probably not at the same time, but you have to think about, hey, there was an order, it's already paid, like in the old process, it's paid, but not yet like picked from stock. Now you change everything, now it's paid and it's shipped directly, that doesn't work, right? So that's a kind of a versioning problem, and you have to think about that, and that's not easy. And normally you not only have 4 services, you have a lot more. I saw customers like startups starting 3 years ago on a greenfield, having like more than 100 services. That was really Wild West. Nobody understood what's going on. And I normally use this metaphor when I introduce microservices. I learned that from Eric Evans. That's the guy who wrote the domain-driven design book. And that's a 3-leg trace. A 3-leg trace means 2 people are like just bound together by their feet, and then they should run. And what you can easily see on the picture is that they're running slower than everybody could run on himself, basically, and the risk of falling down is much higher. And that's exactly what we do in IT. If you need to coordinate between teams for deployment, that's a 3-leg trace. So the whole idea of microservices is to get rid of these 3-leg traces that everybody can run on its own, and that's much faster, right? And much more secure, let's say, in a way. And this is a 3-leg trace. It's even more, I mean, like a 5-leg trace or whatever. So that's a bad idea, actually, to do. I'm putting so much emphasis on that, by the way, because I'm discussing that so often. So I think that's really important to have in mind. So the idea here is what you have to do instead is, it's a very easy idea, actually. You can still have event-driven approaches. You could, for example, have events whenever somebody orders something, so that checkout microservice doesn't know who is responsible for that. Hey, world, somebody has ordered something. I'm done. That's okay. But the order fulfillment, in this case, you might have to command somebody else to do something for you. It's very weird that payment knows about orders. It shouldn't, right? It provides an API. Hey, I could retrieve payment. Whoever needs that, please command me. And the order then like calls it and probably gets back something. Normally people, whenever I do that, say, hey, but we're 2019, we want to have a modern architecture. We don't do REST. We want to do messaging, event-driven. Yes, it's not about the communication protocol. You can do that with messaging. I don't care. You can put a command on Kafka. It totally works. It's about the semantics, how I do the interface, and basically about the coupling. So and that's the next thing. People are saying, yeah, but that's more like tightly coupled. We want to have a loosely coupled architecture. The longer I thought about that, the bigger that's totally nonsense in my eyes. I mean, as soon as two like components communicate, they're coupled. It's unavoidable. If you want to communicate, you're coupled in a way. The decision you can make is either you want to couple on the receiving side, so checkout doesn't know who is interested in that event, but order knows I want to have exactly that event with the data. Then the coupling is on the receiving side. Or you could say, like payment offers something, doesn't know about the clients, but order knows, okay, I want to use that service with that API. Then the coupling is on the sending side, basically. And you have to make the decision on a case-by-case basis. It depends on the two services, on the communication you want to do. And that's what I basically mean when I say you have to balance orchestration and choreography. There's no way around. You have to think about it. I'm sorry, but that's how you have to do that. Okay. If you accept that, which I hope that you accept that, it's probably not the most critical crowd here if you're on the Camunda Day. Then we say, okay, we have that order fulfillment microservice. And then one of the last things which I want to add to the mix here is that if we have microservices, and that's really important actually, if you do microservices, it's always a distributed system. I introduced that with the InfoQ thing, right? It's always a distributed system. I use that metaphor for distributed systems. So this small hut over there, that's your one microservice, that's your one application. Right? You have a lot of control in there. It's cozy, right? You have a heating, you have transaction management and these kind of things. It's one programming language. It's one thread, probably. So it's pretty good here. But whenever you open the door, then you meet the rough ocean, and that's the network. The network works with probabilities. It's probably there, right? Probably not. I mean, you all know the internet. It's like, come on, I want to have some response back. And because of that, and that's actually the main reason for that, to my understanding so far. This orchestration here needs to be stateful. Because I don't know if the payment is available whenever I call it at that time. I don't know how long it takes to get back some response, so I want to have it stateful. And that's actually the reason why I want to use something like, for example, Camunda, like a workflow engine within that microservice to implement that orchestration. I could just code it, but if I code it, I have to code a lot of things for the state handling. And that's what I don't want to do. And that's why it makes a lot of sense to use something like a workflow engine there. Okay. And it still can be REST, right? Wanted to mention that again. By the way, if we're looking throughout the customer base, or even the user base, or even the whole industry, I basically still see two main approaches of doing microservices. So one is like you're really using a message bus or an event bus. I would say it's not science, so it's not like a real number where you can pull up a source, but I would say gut feeling 20-25% of the people of the project are currently do messaging or event buses. So not that much actually, but it's growing, that's growing. And you use that in order to communicate. And the rest is REST-ish. gRPC probably nowadays, or probably even SOAP, or whatever it is, but RPC-style communication. Both is fine, actually. So people always ask me, like, what do you recommend? I would recommend to do that, what you can control, what you can do, what your developers understand, what you probably already have in place. So if you already have a message bus like rolled out everywhere, use that. Architectural-wise, on a whiteboard, I think that's the best architecture you can do at the moment. But on the other hand, most companies just couldn't get along with it. If you have to introduce a message bus or something like Kafka, that's not an easy pick. You shouldn't do that as a side project. That's quite a huge thing. So if you do REST everywhere, do that. Why not? It's not that bad. There are a lot of tools around there which help you with the REST communication. You can even do event-driven with REST. You do, for example, polling and these kind of things. So it's not impossible to do a good architecture with the rest. So that's normally, but I'm kind of like the Switzerland here. I try to get out of that discussion, like, because I mean, we're trying to integrate in both worlds, so that's kind of the thing. There's a third possibility, and I don't want to go into too much detail here, but it's an interesting one actually, because much more customers went that way that I anticipated actually. So instead of doing this, what you could also do, you can use the workflow engine as kind of a, let's say, a work distribution. And then it's kind of a communication channel between microservices. What do I mean by that? So if you make an example with a small process, you could say, like, retrieve payment here. That's a service task. And if you know Camunda, we have something like external tasks or topics, or CB does that. Similarly, you could say retrieve payment has a name, like a topic name, like a queue name. And then you could say, like, payment, for example, payment does it pops up to the workflow engine and say, hey, I can do payment. And then it gets all the work from the workflow engine, does it, talk to it back, and then the workflow continues. This works, I think, even in a microservice environment relatively well if you do the ownership correctly. So the workflow itself must be owned by the right microservice, in this case, the order fulfillment. And like shipment or payment, they just pops up to it with a name, with a logical name. They don't know nothing about the workflow itself. So it's not coupled. It's not like a big monolithic BPMN again. It's really like as a topic. The cool thing about that, I'm not proposing that, by the way, as a best practice architecture. There are drawbacks to that. And as soon as I sense that workflow engines are probably not that hip at the company, I'm not even proposing them, not even talking about that, because these are the architectures which are at least easy to get through normally. The advantage is that you save a couple of problems. So what's the default? Like, that's, I'm normally asked, like, okay, I now want to do that. What do you have on the slides with the different workflows, slicing them for the microservices? How do I do that? Do I run like one workflow engine or like one per microservice? And actually, you can do both. As always, it depends. Like, there are drawbacks of both of them. So the default, my personal default is this. Every microservice that uses a workflow engine has its own one. That's like full autonomy. They can do whatever they want. They can update Camunda whenever they want. They can use a different tool if they like. Like, every team can make its own decision. That's the default. The effort you have with that is that you now maintain a couple of engines, that like monitoring is not that easy because you don't have a central place where you can understand what's going on in my whole system. You have to probably look into different engines, which, by the way, can be an advantage. If you live DevOps, for example, this team might operate its own solution. They might be pretty happy only to looking at their processes, right? So as you see, it's not always a black or white. Running a central engine, or let's say at least a department-wide engine or whatever it is, also possible. Like, you have to at least watch at that closely, that the autonomy of the microservice is not violated, but then it might save effort on the operation side, and that's fine. So just make a conscious decision. I think that's an important thing here. Last thought here, which is also interesting. So if we go with that way, if we have multiple engines, what we see quite some customers doing at the moment is that they build their own monitoring. Like, not a fully fledged Camunda cockpit, not what you saw in the demo earlier on, but a very easy overview that you see there's a workflow running over there, and it's now ended or whatever, or it's in that state. Very easy, but there you can get a first overview what's going on, right? And in order to do that, they're basically sending events from the workflow engine over there. That's very easy. You can build a generic plugin. It's a couple of lines of Java code, actually. It's relatively easy to send over the events, pick it up, and store it somewhere. And then they link back in a way that if you find the right workflow here, you know it's running in that engine, so I can jump to that cockpit, probably with a deep link, and you see what's going on. Okay, so that's not too hard to build. But that's one of the most asked questions normally. Well, how do I do that? In a second, hang on. And if you look at our stack, for example, tools like Optimize, or also in the CB stack, we already prepare the tools to be able to operate with different engines. That was not such a big problem in the past. That's why Cockpit is not able to do it. But we're improving the whole ecosystem to be able to handle that much better. If you want to read about that a bit in more depth, I wrote a blog post last year where I basically go over these architecture choices and try to explain the forces in a bit more detail. Because as you see, it's not an easy, this is a best practice, do exactly that, and the world is safe. No, it has to fit your environment. And that was always our value. We wanted to be in the customer environment. We don't want to force anything on you. There's a blog post. Quick recap. So microservices, I think they're a good idea, not for everything, like always, but they're unavoidable anyway. But you need to balance orchestration and choreography. That's really important. And I think that's worth discussing over and over again, because a lot of people have wrong conceptions there. Track, monitor, manage the flow, that depends a bit. Like you either want to just see what's going on or probably need orchestration. It needs to be stateful. That's why that's our value proposition, because it's distributed, right? You might have to wait for things and these kind of things. Visibility is essential. That's not a secret. And workflow automation, that's kind of the result of it. It's really an essential building block in this architecture. I truly believe that. And obviously, I also believe in BPMN, but that's, I think, pretty clear. If that was too quick for you, or if you want to dive into more details of it, Gottfried said that I give a lot of talks, actually, for even different communities. I have a homepage, so I normally try to get all the slides on there. There are recordings. Some of these talks go into more depth of different aspects of these kind of questions, so feel free to go there. Feel free to send me an email if you need anything. That's all I have. Thank you.